Hello, Venture Atlanta. Hello. How's everybody doing out there? Well, we have a lot of stuff to cover because we're going to save the planet in 30 minutes or less and your money back. My name is John Shieber. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy to be joined by Bill Nussey, who's a partner with Engage VC and TechSquare Ventures.
TechSquare Ventures.
And Sophie Purdom, who is the founder of Planeteer Capital.
That's right.
Excuse me. So I wanted to start this off with like a good news, bad news situation. Which one do y'all want first? You want good news or bad news?
Oh, man. What do you guys think? Bad?
Bad news. Wow.
Like shouting
Y'all
bad. Okay, we know where we are.
Y'all are really into it today.
Yeah.
Okay, so here are some bad news numbers for you. Air pollution causes 7 million premature deaths every year around the world. Weather and climate disasters cost the U.S. $145 billion last year alone. And climate disasters have resulted in $12.5 billion in crop loss in 2021 in the U.S. And that crop loss leads to higher prices for food and higher prices for you, the consumer. All right, but there is some good news. People are working on solutions. Do you want to hear about those numbers?
Tell us the good news.
All right, here's some good news. So the U.S. has now allocated at least $450 billion to spend on the energy transition, which is amazing. And it's a historic amount of money. Startups have raised about $40 to $50 billion over the last 2 years.
A little higher than that.
It's $90 billion,
It's
right?
$90
billion over the last 2
venture.
years.
Yeah.
So climate-focused startups have raised that much money. And on the LP on the venture side, about 72 funds have raised $13 billion in about the last 15 months. There's a lot of money flowing into climate, and there's a lot more money that needs to. So the estimates are somewhere between $1.5 trillion and upwards of $9 trillion needs to get spent every year for the next 20 some odd years to address the climate crisis. And Bill and Sophie are going to help me talk about how that's getting done. But I'd like to kick things off with your take on what climate tech actually is. So when we talk about climate tech, what does that mean? Sophie, you want to take a stab at that first?
I definitely do. And we even have a graphic to be able to talk about that as well. So let me give a quick bit of context before, okay, as we, can you all hear me? All right, great, you're gonna want to because we've got a nerdy graphic behind us now. So this is a chart of data on the climate tech venture-backed companies that have raised funding over just the past 2 years. And like John said before, that's about $70 billion worth of capital flowing into this space, around, call it 1,500 or so different global businesses. I see the phones out. Everybody loves to take a photo of this nerdy graphic. You can find more at a publication called Climate Tech VC. We do exactly what it says on the label, and we track all of this deal activity and then tell you what do you need to know and then how should you think about it. So high-level things to take away from this chart. There's 7 sectors that we track in climate tech. So that ranges from the big ones, the mature ones, food and land use, energy, transportation, often the things that you or I might think about when we think about how do we engage with climate in our day-to-day lives. And then the real emerging kind of bullseye are some of these other 4 verticals: industry, climate management, think climate intelligence, some of the conversations we've been hearing and pitches on stage earlier, built environment, so everything around us and the embodied emissions in that, and then carbon marketplaces, CDR, carbon sequestration technologies.
CDR is carbon direct removal. Carbon dioxide
removal, drawing that bad stuff up and out of that atmosphere and out of the oceans as well, where there's a little bit too much. But anyway, there's so much that we could cover on this graphic. Maybe just take that photo or take that mental image of it and identify a place where you might personally resonate with.
Spoilers, Sophie. We're getting there. We're going to get there in a second. So, Bill, so this is where folks have been investing, and this is sort of what the climate tech landscape looks like. Bill, you literally wrote the book on renewable and sustainable energy. It's called Freeing Energy. You have a podcast, I think, by the same name. And I'm wondering where you think folks should be investing right now. So what is of interest in the opportunity set that you see, given your perspective as a published author?
Well, when a lot of people think about clean tech or climate tech, which has been around for years, they wrap it with the idea of its origin, which is, hey, the environment needs help. Let's lean forward. Let's find some things we need to do to save the future. What got me excited about the space beyond that was that in the last couple of years, it's actually turned into an incredible business. And so we are at the precipice of economic changes where it is actually cheaper. It's been cheaper for 3 or 4 years to generate solar and wind than to generate electricity any other way. And what the tough part about that is that unless you have got a few $1 billion in your pocket, or you're a government or a large utility, which they do great work, it's not something that all of us as entrepreneurs can do. And what's happening in the last couple of years is the prices of solar and battery, particularly, and power electronics have come down so far that it's opening up incredible markets. And for those of you that are not in the clean tech space, I just want to do a shout out for Sophie. She and her partner Kim have done the Clean Tech Venture Capital newsletter. It is, as far as I know, the most widely read newsletter for people that are trying to understand where these opportunities are, some of the best data by entrepreneurs. And so my research, which was born out of some of the data that I got from you guys, when you start to think about the transitions where things become less expensive to use solar and battery. So there's cool things we all see, like parking meters that are powered by solar. That's not necessarily a giant business, but it demonstrates what's happening. The biggest change I think that's happening in electricity, which is the lion's share of electricity and electric vehicles are the two lion's share areas where all the innovation is happening, is the fact that things are moving from giant centralized power plants to small scale. So your electric vehicle is actually a giant moving battery. If you have solar in your house, you're a miniature power plant. And this is a rapidly happening transition, and there's thousands and thousands of businesses and startups that are needed for this. And just, the last point I'll share is that think back to the days when computing days, a few of us, well, not me, but a couple of us here actually remember mainframes were the primary point of computing. And if you went to the world back then and you said, do I need these small computers, these personal computers? And of course you don't. The mainframes are great. But what happened is we moved to the internet, we moved to personal computers, we moved to smartphones. You think about the thousands and thousands of companies and startups and innovation and venture-backed companies that with great exits that enabled that transition from large centralization to small to tiny to consumer. And you have a glimpse of what a lot of people call the emerging energy internet. And that is the broad brush for all the opportunities emerging.
It's a broad brush for a lot of the opportunities that are emerging. I'd argue that there are a few more in places like food, in places like materials and chemicals. Really, across the board, any industry that humans have been involved in involves emitting a lot of greenhouse gases. And so anything that anyone is working on can be a climate company if it's looking at reducing these greenhouse gas emissions, making things more efficiently, and trying to preserve the resources that we have on the planet. So this is all stuff that falls under the banner of climate tech. Are any climate tech deals happening in the Southeast, and what are y'all seeing down here that's exciting to you? So if you want to take a crack at that first?
You bet. I mean, thinking from a macro perspective, again, we track all the deals bottom up. It's not just myself, it's our amazing team. Got to hold this thing right up next to my face, apparently. And yes, we've tracked many. I think maybe it's fun just to name names. Shall we do some of that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a personal favorite because we're investors in them at Footprint Coalition. That's Cove Tool, which is an incredible company based here in Atlanta that's doing amazing work around sort of making buildings as energy efficient as possible from the design phase on out, and creating a marketplace for sustainable products on the back end of that folks can then slot in, and so developers can just have these tools at their disposal to make the greenest building possible. That's one of my faves.
Maybe shout out there of, guess what? Not all climate tech businesses have to be deep tech or hard tech or things that
100%.
Seem to make everybody in the audience sweat. This is an example of a software business and a marketplace that's driving efficiencies and is also capital efficient to build as well.
What about you, Bill? Any favorites?
One of my general categories, and there's a couple here in Atlanta, but they're software primarily companies that are helping people understand, manage, merge, optimize the flow of energy, whether it's flowing to electric vehicles and fleets, or whether it's monitoring solar panels. These tools, for those of us that have been in the digital space for a long time, it's shocking to learn that these simple tools don't actually exist anywhere in the energy space. So this is like going back to the 90s and the internet. It's like, well, I can build a router, right. Okay? But one other thing that's exciting about Georgia in Atlanta that isn't necessarily clean tech, but I think is going to create an incredible downstream clean tech environment, which is that Georgia is one of the top places in the United States to manufacture clean tech products. You know, we've got SK batteries, we've got Q cells, we've got Rivian coming, we've got several recycling plants, battery recycling plants that have opened up. And I used to work at Greylock years ago, and we would always look for the most dynamic companies, and we would find the upper middle managers who were working there every day and were struggling to actually get the job done. They didn't have the software tools or the management, whatever, and we would pluck them out and fund them to start the most innovative startups that ended up changing the world. So the fact that Georgia has such a deep footprint in the energy manufacturing, I think gives us, in a couple of years, is going to create the founders and the fundable companies, even on top of what we're doing today.
Well, and Engage, I will say that Engage has a few companies in their portfolio that are climate focused, right? So Cloverly is one of y'all's.
Yep.
That's a good one. And then there's one other I'm forgetting. Gooder, is that?
Yes, Gooder.
Mm-hmm. And Sophie, did you find anything interesting, or do you see any cool companies coming to the Southeast that you particularly like?
Everybody, I love to pick favorites, but maybe I'll broaden it out a little bit of running with Bill's point around talent. You know how I said before, not every climate business needs to be hardware or deep tech. In the same way, every climate founder, every potential climate entrepreneur doesn't need to be a PhD level, nuclear scientist, right? So we see many different categories of climate founders and builders. That might be, sure, your scientist. That also might be, like Bill was just talking about, an operator who's identified a challenge in a space and now is building with some of these sectors or solution types in mind and is kind of spinning out of an operational role. That might be a technologist that's at one of the FANG companies, or maybe had a reckoning moment when the skies turned orange over San Francisco a couple of years ago, right? And realized they wanted to take their software-oriented skill set and orient that towards climate. Or it might be folks who I identify with quite a lot of this climate first generation, where we've always known that we're going to be inheriting these challenges, and through school, through all life experiences, climate's always been the goal. And so we're there trying to fit our entire careers from kind of day zero into some of these solution areas. So, you were saying all of these companies can be climate companies,
right?
Maybe, but like everybody can certainly be a climate entrepreneur.
100%. So look,
I was just going to say, talk about Cloverly as an example. This is a software company, right? So it's not deep tech. They don't have labs and machines and electron generators. They're actually a software company, and they basically help companies that want to get carbon positive faster to do it without having to change all their infrastructure day one. So this is just a great example of the stuff that I don't think anyone was thinking about 2 or 3 years ago that are now turning into incredibly hot businesses. And that's what's exciting. Again, if you've been around, think about the internet in the late 90s. Digital marketing in the 2010s, that's where all this stuff is right now. Plus, this is actually an existing market that's trillions of dollars a year that's going to be disrupted. So this is a really dynamic time, and now is the time.
So given all of that, what are y'all interested in investing in? What's most appealing to you in the climate space now?
Oh, are you unleashing the beast? I can
Yeah,
go for
go.
hours here.
Let's
How long have
go.
we got? Let's see. So we've recently launched a vehicle, which I can tell you more about in a couple of weeks, to invest in pre-seed and seed climate tech founders. So just starting their journeys, and at the point of incorporation, we want to be there with them. The blessing and the curse of being so deep in the data is it kind of feels like everything's already happening, right? Like that's the beautiful thing about being a part of an organization like this that tracks all the activity. It's kind of an overwhelming flood. It went from a trickle to now like a massive river. And so big question of, is there space for another climate dedicated fund? And the answer to that is certainly yes, at the precipice. So we look at these inflecting, emerging sectors and subsectors within climate, and a few of those that catch our fancy tend to be pretty intersectional. So think like, where does the built environment overlap with carbon capture, for example? So thinking about buildings as point source emissions and using some very light sensor type of technologies to reduce and optimize energy consumption because it's cheaper and better to operate the building and less dangerous, but then also being able to, snap your finger and drive that emission profile immediately to zero by implementing some really cheap type of carbon capture on site, right? So kind of, I love those combinatory intersectional types of businesses and where they're not massively infrastructure heavy, because frankly lots of it already exists. And so it's how do we take technologies from other sectors and bring that in there without changing the experience of anybody in the building, right? Like, isn't that amazing that you could go to net zero without really changing any infrastructure overnight? So concepts like that get me excited. I think there's a lot to do in ocean tech, for example.
Yeah, 100%.
In CDR, so again, that carbon dioxide removal, but particularly, maybe less the technologies have gotten quite a lot of hype recently, so that sector has been 8xing in terms of the count of companies and also the dollars deployed, quarter over quarter for the last 4 quarters. That's like mind-boggling. It came from nowhere, and now it's here. But within that, I am very curious to find new measurement, verification, and reporting approaches. I think you can.
On Ocean Tech, didn't the founder of HubSpot just launch a fund today or yesterday
Ryan
on Ocean
Halligan,
Tech?
my
Yes.
best bud. Yeah, exactly. So check that one out. It's called Propeller. It's a $100 million new dedicated vehicle. They literally announced it a couple hours ago. And that's, talk about folks that are transitioning into climate, that are those operator types. Brian ran and founded and is the chairperson of HubSpot. That, he'll kill me, but like that has nothing to do with climate, right? And then has a passion, Woods Hole, and thinking about how can he take his skill sets and his network and deploy capital into a really niche area of climate. We also saw a fire tech fund exclusively start a couple weeks back. So there's a real specialization movement happening here, and also generalist funds bringing aboard a climate type of partner and realizing that you don't actually need to be a specialist to be investing in this. This is a theme, not an industry.
Right.
The reason I wrote this book, Freeing Energy, and started this podcast years ago was that I had this epiphany as a longtime digital tech entrepreneur, having run some companies here in town, Silverpop and IXL, and I saw this as the next biggest thing ever, and I realized that no one I talked to in the digital tech space understood how big this was going to be, so I wrote this book. I interviewed 400 people, went all over the world to find the things that translated from people that had my experience, like Brian Halligan, into how does it apply to this new world? How do you apply all the things you learned as a digital expert, digital business person into the clean tech world? And there's 2 areas that I get pretty excited about. They're kind of boring. And it doesn't have, and the climate, in all honesty, is a side benefit. They're just fantastic businesses that people are just starting to see. One of them is broadly, I call choreographing electrons. People don't know it, that the entire US grid is it's a couple of circuits, but there's 3 or 4 circuits. So every single house and building connected in everywhere in the state of Georgia is on the same circuit. And that needs to change as your electric vehicles charging or being discharged on the grid, your house, you have a battery in your house, or you have power plants turning on and off. So the choreographing of electrons is going to be a massive space. And particularly, electric utilities play this pivotal role today because they are the backbone internet of energy, and they are challenged with how do I adopt to this crazy fast-changing world. And there's a whole clash of startups, hundreds of startups going, how can I help utilities do this? At the same time, the other startups are helping people decentralize faster. So this is, it's happening so fast, and in 3 years, the grid's gonna look different than it does today in ways that hopefully none of us perceive. We plug the plug in, it works, but the back end is gonna be as different as it could be 3, 5, 10 years.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful example of transition and disruption happening within one space. And I think that's, throughout these, call it, the 7 verticals or however you want to parse this large theme, that transition and disruption, healthy tension exists everywhere. And so again, if you're taking away kind of like frameworks, maybe that's a useful one as well.
Yeah, I think it's that's a very helpful way to think about what's happening with this energy transition, and sort of defossilization broadly, I think, because as we move away from, I don't know, I just made it up.
Never heard that before.
As we move away from using fossil fuels, like fossil fuels sort of permeate everything, right? Every other industry, plastics, chemicals, materials, fertilizer, all of this stuff is based off of the use of fossil fuels to a large degree. So finding ways to, or finding alternative materials or alternative products that you can use to supplement for these fossil fuels as we move away from using them is incredibly important as well.
I feel compelled to point out that the in many of those cases, most of those companies that are moving us away from fossil fuels are actually creating better solutions that are cheaper.
100%.
And I always, as much as we talk about climate and CO2, which I think is critical, what's happening now is these are actually better products at better prices with better features that last longer and are better in every single way. But we've rested on our laurels as a society on the electric grid, on the fossil fuel economy for 100 years, and there just hasn't been incentives to create radical changes. And frankly, the industries didn't want the changes. And you know, whether it was nefarious cobbles that prevented or just an inertia, but the technologies have hit the tipping point now. In like last 2 or 3 years, the next 2 or 3 years, the tipping points are driving us into better products at a better price. That's where the venture investors should be looking.
So why is this happening now? What's changed?
Wonderful, and I'll build off of that as well and say nothing motivates the U.S. to act more than national security. So you can think about climate as a lot of things, but it's for sure a great way to build a resilient society that doesn't rely on autocratic forces that don't believe in the fundamental things that we built our country on. So I don't know, if you're into national security, odds are you're probably also into climate tech. So hot take, you heard it on stage here first.
I think actually the Biden administration just said that like a few days ago.
They literally released the National Security Strategy Plan and it said that, yep.
So maybe not so hot.
Yeah, fair
but
enough.
why now? So what's changed now?
Why now? You want to
I was
start?
going to say, this is the biggest epiphany I had in all of my work was that particularly solar and batteries are technologies, not fuels. I think this is the single largest driver of the disruptions that are happening. And you think about technologies, you know, if you get a new iPhone in 3 years, you're not going to be absolutely in awe that its camera is better and that it has more memory. You're going to be disappointed because the iPhones are based on technologies, they're based on mass manufacturing, making billions and billions of components better and better. Well, that's actually the same exact trend that batteries, it's not as steep, but batteries and solar cells are going through that same technology transition where they just get cheaper and cheaper. So if you look at the solar cells on satellites when the US was launching these in the 70s, today a solar cell is 1/400th the cost. And that price is going to continue to go down and down and down to where solar is going to be by far the least expensive way to generate energy that's ever been invented. And batteries are coming behind it, so when the sun's not shining, oh gosh, how are we going to run the grid? How are we going to power our house? Well, batteries are getting insanely cheap too. And this, I believe, is enabling all kinds of follow-on opportunities, including indoor agriculture and new material creation. But these two fundamental realities, that solar and batteries are technologies, not fuels, is what's changing everything for me.
One more popcorning?
Yeah, if you want to add on to that.
Definitely.
Build on
I'd say the sophistication of the climate capital stack is fundamentally different.
Right.
So you might not believe it, but we've been asked before, why is it different this time, right? Like a lot of folks in this audience and on this stage lived through and invested through the Clean Tech 1.0 boom and bust. Turns out that a lot of those investing structures were not necessarily perfectly tailored to invest in the intricacies of climate technologies, timelines, sometimes capital intensity, need to align with policy incentives, et cetera, and that's fundamentally different this time, right? So I say sophistication because it's not just bigger, but it's better, and that's not just venture. Although I will say the venture funds are now specialized and specifically structured to orient towards the needs of climate businesses, but it comes before that with catalytic capital structures, with well-structured government grants and programs, and comes with incubators, and then it follows on with private equity, debt, project finance, infrastructure, SPACs, you name it, right? The capital
SPACs.
stack is different. I did say SPACs. That's one that definitely comes to mind.
I think just to build on that, I would add a couple of sort of macro level things. One is that the argument's pretty much settled now that climate change is real, that it's happening, and that it's destroying a lot of things and causing a lot of death and costing a lot of money. So addressing that is a huge concern. That even a decade ago, there were still arguments around whether or not this was a valid thing to be concerned about. So from a national security perspective, from the stability of our society perspective, like it is pretty real. And I think most people realize that. And beyond that, I think there have been fundamental advances in sort of core technologies that have enabled a lot of innovation on top of that, right? So machine learning, the ability to create new materials, our ability to manipulate the genetic material in new ways as well, are all creating new opportunities in deep technologies to really solve some of these problems that before weren't solvable. As we look at sort of removing fossil fuels from the equation of more and more aspects of our lives. But to the energy point, I mean, that's just been a remarkable revolution in driving down costs to make things cheaper and better.
I'm going to disagree with you on something you said a second ago, because we're going to.
All right, let's get it.
So I put the book out there, and I've done dozens and dozens of speeches and interviewed as a guest on podcasts, and I actually seek out people that are in no way comfortable that climate change is real. And I get interviewed by a lot of people who, whether it's from a political point of view or just skeptical in general, they live in parts of the country where they just don't understand. Maybe it's happening, maybe it isn't. You know, everyone I talk to says this is not as big a deal and it's just the government trying. And so I really look for people that are actually having this conversation. If any of you folks are in the mode, well, I'm not entirely sure I see this. There's actually some great places to go find the conversations. You can hear both sides. You can hear people of good intent and good data arguing it out. I personally did the math for a couple of years. It's very clear to me. But I would say that the thing that brings everyone together, and my big message, is that this is a phenomenal business.
Yeah.
And if you can actually save the world and reduce carbon and not even notice it, because you're actually returning incredible returns to your investors. And that's why I wrote the book. That's why I'm so passionate, why I got into the space, because we can disagree on a lot of things as Americans and across the world. We can disagree on stupid things. But putting more money in the pockets of families and communities, everyone agrees with that.
Right.
And that's, I think, climate tech is the biggest opportunity to do that that's ever existed.
I 100% agree with that. So when you think about all of these tailwinds that are moving the industry forward, what concerns do you have about it? Like, what would be the thing that would throw this train off the tracks?
Good question.
I gotta have one good question, Bill.
These are awesome questions. I would say that we are at a stage right now where we're policy sensitive. And the U.S. just did something no one expected. They leaned into it. Most of the money the U.S. did in this new law is actually incentives rather than writing checks. It just says, if you don't build a big battery solar plant, the government's not going to write a check. But if you do build it, you can get some money back. So it's not like it's just give away money, which I always like to point out. And I think it's possible that some of that's going to get undone, unlikely. But that's really putting a gigantic tailwind because the U.S. has had almost, depending on whatever you've heard, I will tell you, I've looked at this, the U.S. has tiny incentives towards this transition, and this is the first time the U.S. has really leaned into it, as Europe has been doing and China is starting to do. So I think that if it turns what's that?
I said, well, China's been doing it for a while.
Right, China's leaned into it very heavily as from a policy, top-down government point of view, into clean energy, to be clear, and to clean tech. So the U.S. is now finally catching on, and I think if that slows, that would be a bummer. That would be the biggest thing I'd worry about.
Yeah. I kind of think about this shift that we're going through literally right now as a new industrial policy. I don't know, new industrial schema. It's like a new model essentially where we can leave climate even like out of the conversation. It's a place of building for abundance from a sense of supply chain. Like supply incentives as opposed to demand requirements or kind of drivers. We're building meaning the government incentives and the Inflation Reduction Act is almost like moving the elbow of the free hand of the market towards restructuring supply to better fit for, again, the place of abundance, the place of resilience, lower cost, cheaper, better. Think the Mr. Burns effect of if you're the most Cruella de Vil effect, who cares? If you're the most self-censored person in the world, odds are you want the best, sexiest car, so you're probably going to buy a Tesla, even if it doesn't,
well, or
okay,
Rivian
or a Rivian
now,
okay, or
I'm partial to
Rivian.
Not a
here in
Fisker.
Georgia.
50. I mean, look, radical abundance is the goal, I think, for
Indeed.
all of this stuff, right? And we are entering a period where, for whatever reason, whether it's because of global warming or not, we're entering a period of scarcity. And so investing in innovation that can get us out of that and to a place of radical abundance where we can keep doing all the things we want to do, but just do them in a way that has a little bit of a lighter footprint on the planet is a good way to be. And with that, we are out of time. I have like 20 more questions I could have asked y'all. But appreciate y'all in the audience listening. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you, Venture Atlanta. Thank you, Sophie and Bill.
Thanks, team.
Y'all have a good
Thanks,
one.
you guys.